Snow fell quietly over the frontier that night, softening the sharp edges of a land that had long forgotten warmth. The little town slept beneath the weight of winter, its windows glowing faintly with the flicker of lanterns and laughter. But out beyond the last cabin light, where the prairie stretched into silence, a poor cowboy sat alone by a dying fire. His horse was gone, his boots worn thin, and the only sound that kept him company was the wind whispering through the pines. It was Christmas Eve, a night meant for family, for faith, for belonging. Yet he had none of those things left. He remembered other Christmases, long ago, when his mother's voice had filled their small home with hymns and the scent of wood smoke and bread. But that home had burned to the ground years back, and with it went every piece of the life he once knew. Since then, the cowboy had drifted from town to town, a ghost in worn leather, too proud to beg, too tired to fight. People saw him as another forgotten soul of the West, a man lost in his silence, carrying a sorrow too deep to share. The town's church bells rang faintly in the distance, their echo reaching the edges of the plains like a memory, refusing to die. The cowboy looked toward the sound, his breath clouding in the cold. He wanted to believe there was still something left in this world worth holding on to, but the light inside him had dimmed long ago. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer he barely remembered, asking for nothing, only that the night might pass quickly. But fate, as the West often proved, has a way of turning silence into miracles. From the darkness came the soft crunch of small footsteps against snow. The cowboy lifted his head, his hand instinctively reaching for the revolver at his side, but what he saw stopped him cold. A little girl stood there, no older than 10, her coat torn, her cheeks red from the wind. She held a lantern that glowed weakly in her trembling hands, its light cutting through the cold like a fragile hope refusing to die. "Sir," she said softly, her voice trembling but kind, "you shouldn't be alone on Christmas." The cowboy stared at her, his throat tightening, unsure if she was real or a dream sent by the ghosts of his past. But when she smiled, small, brave, and warm despite the winter, something inside him stirred for the first time in years. The lonely night had not brought an end. It had brought him a beginning. The little girl's voice was soft, but it carried through the cold air like a melody meant only for him. The cowboy blinked against the snowflakes drifting into his eyes, unsure what to say. No one had spoken to him kindly in years, and the gentleness in her tone cut deeper than any harsh word ever could. She was small, fragile even, but her presence warmed the night in a way his fire never could. "Where's your family, child?" he asked at last, his voice rough like wind over dry stone. She hesitated, her gaze falling. "Gone," she whispered. "They were taken by the sickness last winter." The cowboy's heart sank. He knew that kind of loss too well. The ache of having nowhere to go, the silence left behind when laughter fades from a home. He looked at the lantern in her hand. It flickered weakly, just like the fire that was dying beside him. She held it closer to her chest, as if guarding something sacred. "I saw your fire from the road," she said softly. "I thought maybe you wouldn't mind if I stayed a while." He wanted to tell her no. He wanted to send her away before the weight of her presence cracked open something he had fought years to bury. But he saw the frost clinging to her lashes, the way her small body shivered under the tattered coat, and he couldn't do it. "Sit," he muttered, nodding toward the fire. "Ain't much left, but it'll do." She smiled faintly, and for a moment, the loneliness that had haunted him for so long seemed to step back into the shadows. As she warmed her hands by the flame, he found himself studying her. The worn shoes, the way she hummed softly to herself, the small cross that hung from a string around her neck. She wasn't afraid of him, though most grown men were. There was something about her stillness, her quiet courage, that disarmed him completely. He saw in her eyes not pity, but recognition, the kind of recognition only souls scarred by loss could share. The wind howled through the pines again, but this time it didn't sound so lonely. The cowboy added a few more sticks to the fire, watching it come back to life. "You got a name?" he asked, his tone gentler now. "Clara," she said. "And you?" He paused. The answer caught in his throat. "Name don't matter much anymore," he said quietly. But Clara just smiled. "Then I'll call you Mr. Cowboy." The night stretched on, quiet and endless. Clara talked softly, her words painting pictures of her parents, of a Christmas that once smelled of pine and bread and laughter. She spoke of the little church at the edge of town, now abandoned, its windows shattered by wind, but how she still went there sometimes, just to sing hymns to herself. The cowboy listened, his eyes fixed on the fire, afraid that if he looked at her too long, he'd see the ghost of everything he had lost. Yet, in her voice, there was something pure, something that reminded him what it felt like to be alive. When the wind died down, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small piece of jerky, hard as stone but enough to share. "Ain't much of a feast," he said, handing it to her, "but it'll fill your belly." Clara's eyes lit up as if he'd offered her gold. "Thank you," she whispered. "Mama always said food tastes better when it's shared." The cowboy's throat tightened. It had been years since anyone had thanked him for anything. They sat in silence after that, the firelight flickering against their faces. The cowboy couldn't stop thinking about the church she had mentioned, the broken windows, the forgotten hymns. He used to believe in things like that once. Faith, redemption, second chances. But war and loss had stripped those beliefs from him long ago. And yet, somehow, this child's presence, her innocence, her courage, was rekindling a faith he thought had died. As midnight drew near, Clara reached in her pocket and pulled out a small, worn candle. "Mama always lit one on Christmas," she said softly. "Said it was to guide lost souls home." She pressed it into his hand. Maybe we can light it for them both tonight." The cowboy looked at her for a long moment, his eyes glistening in the glow of the fire. "All right," he said finally. "Let's bring him home." He struck a match, and together they lit the candle. Its flame burned small but steady, swaying with the winter wind. In that moment, the cold seemed to fade, the silence softened, and two souls, one hardened by loss, one innocent yet broken, found warmth in something neither of them had felt in years: hope. The small flame flickered between them, casting long shadows over the snow. The cowboy stared at it in silence, watching how it refused to die despite the wind that tried to snuff it out. There was something about that light, fragile yet fierce, that mirrored the little girl beside him. Clara hummed softly, an old hymn barely audible beneath the whisper of the wind. Her voice trembled, but never faltered. And for a man who had forgotten the sound of peace, that simple melody felt like grace itself. He leaned back against a fallen log, his eyes never leaving the flame. "How long you been out here alone?" he asked. Clara hesitated, tracing a circle in the snow with her finger. "Since spring," she said. "A family took me in for a while, but they moved on. I stayed. Didn't want to leave Mama and Papa behind." Her words cut through him like the chill of the air, not because of their sadness, but because of the strength beneath them. She had no one left, and yet she hadn't given up. The cowboy thought of his own life, of the choices that led him to this lonely road. He had fought wars that left him with nothing but scars and silence. He had turned away from everyone who tried to reach him, believing that solitude was the only thing he deserved. But now, beside this little girl with her stubborn flame and fragile faith, he began to wonder if even the most broken souls could find their way back. He reached into his saddlebag once more and pulled out a small piece of cloth, a faded red ribbon, the last remnant of his mother's Christmas dress. He hadn't touched it in years. Without a word, he tied it around the base of the candle. Clara smiled softly. "For them?" she asked. He nodded. "For all of us," he said quietly. "For everyone who's got no one left to light a candle for them." As the night deepened, the wind softened. Snow continued to fall, but the flames stood strong, burning against the darkness. The cowboy realized that something was changing inside him, a slow, quiet thaw that began at his heart. He didn't know if it was the light, the girl, or the memory of home, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. When morning came, the fire had burned down to embers, and the world around them was bathed in a soft golden light. Clara was still asleep, curled beneath his worn coat, her small hand clutching the candle. The cowboy watched her for a long time, realizing that the girl had done something no preacher, no prayer, and no whiskey bottle ever could. She had given him a reason to stay alive. He rose quietly and walked toward his horse, brushing the frost from its mane. His mind was heavy with thought. Christmas morning had always been a ghost from his past, a memory he refused to face. But now, he felt the pull of something greater. Maybe, he thought, it wasn't too late to make things right. Not for himself, but for her. When Clara woke, she found him packing his things. "You're leaving?" she asked, her voice still soft with sleep. He turned to her, his weathered face softened by the morning light. "Only to town," he said. "You said that old church was still standing, didn't you?" She nodded, blinking in confusion. "Then that's where we're going," he said, tightening the saddle strap. "Figure if there's any day to bring light back to it, it's today." They rode through the snow in silence, the world quiet except for the sound of hooves crunching through ice. When they reached the church, it looked worse than he expected. Half the roof had caved in, the door hung loose, and the cross that once crowned it lay broken on the ground. Yet, as Clara climbed off the horse, her eyes filled with wonder. "It's still beautiful," she whispered. The cowboy said nothing. He took the candle from her hands and placed it on the broken altar, where sunlight filtered through the shattered windows. "Go on," he said, stepping back. Clara knelt and lit the wick again, her small voice rising in song. The hymn echoed through the empty walls, soft but strong, and as her voice carried out into the open plains, the cowboy felt the quiet weight of redemption settling on his shoulders. As Clara's voice filled the old church, the sound wove through the broken beams and shattered glass like a prayer rising from the ruins. The cowboy stood near the door, hat in hand, his rough fingers tracing the grooves of the wood. He hadn't stepped into a church since before the war, before everything he cared for turned to dust. Yet standing there, listening to the orphan girl sing a hymn she barely remembered, he felt something shift. The emptiness that had haunted him for years began to fade, replaced by a quiet peace he couldn't explain. When her song ended, the silence that followed was almost holy. Sunlight broke through a crack in the roof, falling across the altar and lighting the candle she placed there. The flame flickered, catching the dust in golden patterns that seemed to dance. "It's like they're here," Clara whispered. "Mama and Papa." The cowboy swallowed hard. "Maybe they are," he said softly. "Maybe they've been here all along." He turned to leave, but something in the distance caught his ear, the crunch of footsteps over snow. His instincts sharpened. He motioned for Clara to stay quiet. Through the doorway, he saw 3 men approaching, their silhouettes sharp against the white horizon. He recognized one of them instantly. A ranch hand he'd once worked with, now turned to the outlaw's path. The others carried rifles slung across their backs. Trouble had a way of finding him, even on holy ground. The men entered without shame, their boots echoing across the wooden floor. "Well, I'll be," the leader drawled. "Didn't think I'd find you in a church, cowboy." His grin was cruel, his eyes darker than the storm clouds gathering behind him. "Looks like you found yourself some company, too." His gaze landed on Clara. "Cute little thing. Don't seem right for a man like you to be playing father." The cowboy didn't move. His silence was steady, his gaze cold. "You best walk back out that door," he said, voice low and calm. "Ain't no trouble here worth finding." But men like that didn't listen to peace. They only understood power. And in that moment, the cowboy knew that the past he'd tried to bury was about to rise again, right there in front of the girl who had reminded him what goodness looked like. The leader laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the stone walls. "Still the same, aren't you?" he sneered. "Quiet as a grave, but dangerous as a rattler." He stepped closer, his boots scraping against the old floorboards. "Thing is, we ain't here for you. We're here for what you've got. Heard tell you've been riding with a full saddle. Gold, maybe. Or something worth talking." His grin widened. "Reckon we'll find out." The cowboy's eyes flicked to Clara, who stood frozen near the altar. He had nothing to give them, nothing but the life he'd rebuilt from the ashes. And now, even that was being threatened. "Ain't nothing here but a candle and a prayer," he said quietly. "You take either one, and you'll wish you hadn't." His voice carried no anger, only certainty, the kind that comes from a man who's already made peace with whatever comes next. The outlaws exchanged glances, their laughter rising like hyenas circling prey. One of them grabbed the candle, snuffing the flame with his fingers. "Guess prayers don't mean much out here," he taunted. The girl gasped, her eyes filling with tears as the last bit of light vanished. But before the laughter could fade, The cowboy moved. Fast, silent, precise. He wasn't young anymore, but experience had its own kind of speed. In one motion, he drew his revolver and fired. A single shot that struck the leader's hand clean, sending his gun spinning across the floor. The others froze. Smoke curled in the air. The cowboy's voice broke the silence. "You'll light that candle again," he said, his tone low and unshaking, "and you'll leave her be." For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then, the leader, clutching his bleeding hand, nodded toward his men. They backed away, muttering curses, disappearing into the snow as quickly as they'd come. When the sound of their boots finally faded, the cowboy holstered his weapon and walked back to the altar. Clara was crying softly, her small hands trembling as she relit the candle. "You see," he said gently, kneeling beside her, "ain't a storm in this world strong enough to kill light when you've got faith to keep it burning." The snow began to fall again, soft and slow, as if the heavens themselves were blessing the small church. Clara sat near the altar, her candle glowing brighter than before. The cowboy leaned against the doorway, his shoulders heavy from years of wandering, yet somehow lighter than they had been the night before. The silence between them was not empty. It was sacred. For the first time, he understood that peace wasn't something you found in gold or glory. It was something you made room for in the stillness of your own heart. Clara turned toward him, her eyes reflecting the candlelight. "Do you think God forgot about us?" she asked. Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from the fragile hope of a child who had lost too much. The cowboy looked at her for a long time before answering. "No," he said softly. "I think sometimes he just waits for the right light to show up in the dark." Clara smiled, and for that moment, the world outside the broken walls of the church didn't feel so cold anymore. But the cowboy's peace was short-lived. As night approached once more, he knew the outlaws wouldn't stay gone for long. Men like that didn't take humiliation kindly, and the echo of his shot would carry through the valley. He checked his revolver, the same one that had seen too many winters, and quietly walked outside. The snow had covered the trail of the men he'd scared off, but his instincts told him they'd be back before dawn. He looked back at the church, its faint glow spilling through the cracks in the wood, and for the first time, he felt fear, not for himself, but for her. The thought of harm coming to the little girl who had brought him light on the loneliest night of the year stirred something fierce inside him. He had nothing left in this world, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would not let the darkness take her. As the first stars appeared, he sat by the frozen road, hat low, gun at his side. He waited, not as a drifter anymore, but as a guardian. In the distance, he saw the flicker of lanterns. The men were coming. He exhaled slowly, whispering a quiet prayer beneath his breath. If this is where it ends, let her wake to peace. The night erupted in chaos before the world could breathe. The outlaws came fast, their boots crunching through snow, their lanterns cutting across the darkness. The cowboy rose from the shadows, calm as a grave, his revolver gleaming faintly in the moonlight. The first man barely had time to shout before a shot rang out, sharp and final. The others scattered, firing blindly into the wind. The quiet of the night was shattered by thunder, smoke, and steel. Inside the church, Clara fell to her knees, clutching the candle. She prayed out loud, her small voice breaking between sobs. "Please keep him safe. Please don't let the light go out." Her tears fell onto the cold stone floor, and the flame trembled but held steady, its glow painting her face in gold. Every sound outside made her heart jump, but she never stopped praying, not once. The battle didn't last long. The cowboy's aim was true, but his strength was fading. One bullet grazed his shoulder, another caught his side. He pressed his hand to the wound, feeling the warmth of his own blood against the cold. Still, he didn't retreat. He fought not for vengeance, but for something purer, for the small spark of hope that had entered his life when that little girl said, "You shouldn't be alone on Christmas." When the last gunshot faded, the plains returned to silence. The outlaws lay scattered, their rage buried in the snow. The cowboy dropped to one knee, his breath coming in slow, ragged bursts. The world blurred around him, the stars above spinning like halos. He looked toward the church, where a faint light still burned through the cracks. Somehow that was enough. Clara rushed out moments later, her small feet stumbling through the snow until she reached him. "You're hurt," she cried, tears streaking her cheeks. He managed a weak smile. "Ain't nothing I can't handle," he whispered. "Just promise me one thing, kid. Keep that light burnin'." She nodded through her tears, holding the candle between them. Its flame reflected in his eyes as he murmured, "Then it was all worth it." The first light of dawn crept slowly across the frozen land, turning the snow from silver to gold. Inside the church, Clara sat beside the cowboy, who rested against the wall, pale but steady. The bullet had grazed deep, but his spirit held stronger than his body. He watched the candle flicker in her hands and smiled faintly. "You did good," he whispered. "That flame never gave up." She looked at him through tear-filled eyes. "Neither did you." He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that he had given up long ago, that she had been the one to bring him back, but his voice faltered. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out the red ribbon tied around the candle the night before. "Take this," he said softly. "It belonged to my mother. She used to say red was the color of faith. It keeps you warm when the world turns cold." Clara's hands trembled as she accepted it. "Then I'll never take it off," she promised. Outside, the wind had calmed, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The cowboy's thoughts drifted like smoke, memories of laughter, of home, of a life before war and wandering. It all came back to him in fragments. His mother's song, his father's hands, the warmth of family on a Christmas long gone. And for the first time, he realized that life had given him another chance at that love, through a little girl who had refused to let him stay in the dark. Clara leaned against him, her small frame wrapped in his worn coat. "Will you stay?" she asked quietly. He looked down at her, his gaze filled with something between sadness and peace. "I'll stay for a while," he said, though they both knew what he meant. His strength was fading, but there was no fear in him, only gratitude. Gratitude that his last Christmas hadn't been one of silence, but one of light. As the sun rose higher, its rays poured through the shattered roof, filling the church with gold. The cowboy's breathing slowed, his eyes fixed on the candle's flame. Clara held his hand tightly, whispering the same hymn she had sung the night before. When his hand finally went still, the flame danced once and burned on. The town buried him beneath the old oak behind the church. It was Clara who chose the spot, saying the light reached that patch of ground longer than anywhere else. The townsfolk came quietly, heads bowed, their hearts heavy with guilt and reverence. None had known the man well, but all had heard what he'd done. The poor drifter who gave everything to protect a child that wasn't his own. By the time they left, the snow had covered his grave, leaving only the candle burning at its foot. Clara stayed long after everyone was gone. She knelt by the mound of earth, her breath rising in soft clouds, the red ribbon tied in her hair fluttering in the wind. "You said faith keeps you warm," she whispered. "I think you were right." Her voice broke, but she smiled through her tears. "I'll keep the light burning. Always." She pressed her small hands around the candle to shield it from the wind, and for a moment, it seemed the world itself leaned closer to listen. Years passed, and the story became legend. Travelers spoke of a little church in the valley where a single candle burned every Christmas Eve, no matter how strong the storm. Some said the light never went out because the man's spirit still guarded it. Others said the girl's faith was enough to keep it alive. But Clara knew the truth. It wasn't just his spirit that stayed. It was his kindness, his sacrifice, his light. As she grew, the church became her home. She welcomed anyone who wandered in from the cold, strangers, outlaws, orphans, offering them warmth and a place to rest. Each Christmas Eve, she would light the same candle, its flame bright against the dark, and whisper the words the cowboy had left her with. "Ain't a storm in this world strong enough to kill light when you've got faith to keep it burning." And so, the legend lived on. The poor cowboy who had once sat alone on Christmas Eve was no longer forgotten. Through the light he left behind, through the child he saved, his silence became eternal, a quiet promise that in the darkest nights, even a single flame can guide the lost home. The story of the poor cowboy and the orphaned girl became more than a memory whispered around fires. It became a testament to the power of grace in the darkest of nights. He had nothing to give, no gold to offer, no legacy to claim. Yet in the end, He gave everything that mattered. Through his sacrifice, a small flame survived the cold, burning brighter than all the stars above the western sky. That light, born from loss and love, became the proof that even broken souls can create miracles. Every Christmas Eve thereafter, travelers spoke of the little church that glowed like a beacon across the snow. Some said it was the girl's faith that kept the candle burning. Others swore it was the cowboy's spirit guarding it still. But maybe it was both, a promise shared between two lonely hearts who found in each other what the world had taken away. Hope. The kind of hope that doesn't shout or boast, but simply stays, quietly lighting the way. The tale reminds us that sometimes the smallest acts, offering warmth to a stranger, sharing the last flame, or standing up against darkness, carry the power to outlive us all. The cowboy's silence spoke louder than any sermon. He showed that the measure of a man is not in what he owns or says, but in the love he leaves behind when the world grows cold. And though his voice is gone, his light still burns in every heart that chooses kindness over comfort, faith over fear. Perhaps that's the truest meaning of Christmas on the frontier. That light doesn't come from the sky. It comes from within. It's the courage to give when you have nothing left, to forgive when it hurts, and to believe, even when everything around you says not to. The cowboy didn't save the world that night, but he saved one soul. And sometimes, that's enough to change everything. If this story touched your heart, let its light keep spreading. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Share what this tale meant to you. Subscribe for more stories that honor the spirit of the Old West, where silence carried truth and kindness built legends. And if you believe that even the smallest light can defy the coldest night, leave a like, because that's how we keep the flame alive together.